Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hemp Your Health. I'm Christy, the Director of Education at Seed to System and your host. And Hemp Your Health is an educational and informational show that brings the intention of expansion and elevation. And because it is only informational and educational, anything I say is not meant to treat or diagnose illness. However, we do bring on experts that share their expertise, their wisdom, and experience for the betterment of humans, animals, plants, and the planet. And today is a very special day. It is April 20th or 4/20, and most of you might know that as Cannabis Day, and the day that we celebrate cannabis. And just to make sure we are all on the same page, cannabis means both marijuana and hemp. And the defining difference is that marijuana is naturally high in THC and hemp is naturally high in CBD and low in THC. I want all of you to know that at Seed to System, we honor and respect THC and our sister marijuana because we have so much to be grateful for. Science and its exploration, because of the THC, we have exploded the understanding in the understanding of the endocannabinoid system, its receptors, in the hundreds of other cannabinoids and terpenes there, and how all the endocannabinoids, the endocannabinoid system, all work together for the betterment of not only human health, but the planet, the soil, the air, all this innovation that is going to come from hemp and cannabis. So our guest today chose this date to be with us because he also recognizes the power of the plant and the power of the planet. And our guest today is James Knapp. James Knapp is the owner of Sacred Earth Wellness Boutique in Mandeville, Louisiana. He is a pioneer in the health food industry and has been for nearly a decade. His expertise and wisdom comes from product education, demoing, sales, and natural supplement consulting. His unparalleled passion for health and well-being come through in his lectures and in guest appearances just like this. You will find James hanging out majority of his time at Sacred Earth Wellness in Mandeville, Louisiana, and with his family. James, my friend, welcome.
So excited to be here, Christy. And very humbled to be here as well. You know, your intro was fantastic. I heard the term expert and I'm like, wow, I'm just a humble man who has a fascination with life and biology, right? And so hopefully some of that I can communicate to you guys in a helpful way today. But thank you for having me. It's a special day indeed. Grateful to be with you, Kristen.
Well, thank you. And we were just talking before the show. I feel like I have a lot to learn from you. And indeed, we're going to get this party started because when you and I first started to connect, I was like, wow, it's not very often that you feel like a kindred spirit, especially on some of these topics that you're going to dig into. One of those topics is the microbiome. And this is so important because biology has changed, my friends, and we have a whole new paradigm. And James, to get us off on this course, if people are not familiar with what and where the microbiome is, can you give us an overview of what and where it is and some of its functions?
Yes, I would love so. Perhaps, Christy, we could start with an intention today. What do you think about
Oh
that?
my gosh, thank you. Yes, the intention is so important. Please, yes.
Um, I do. I think it's appropriate and it's proper for what we're about to discuss. And the fact that we're connecting and we're spending this time together, like, why not take the opportunity to have an intention? So for today, you guys, if you're listening to us now, or if you're listening to this later, go ahead and take a deep breath. Take a big inhale and take a big exhale. That might be the deepest breath we take today. And if it is, great. So the intention for today, for this conversation, I'd like it to be, let's inspire curiosity, okay? If we inspire curiosity, right, if we can maintain this excitable feeling of curiosity in regards to life and our relationships, well, then we can have this sensation of connection and we can be in awe of this amazing life experience, right? And so through this conversation we're going to have today, we're going to be given a lot of information, a lot of ideas. I think it'll be very creative. I think it'll be fun. Hopefully this stokes the fire within us. Hopefully we can grow our own sense of curiosity from this conversation. And if not, perhaps inspire a whole new way of thinking as far as our relationship with our body and to stay curious about that relationship. So that's the goal. That's the focus. That's the intention. And let's go ahead and get it on.
I love that. Curiosity. Personally, I am very curious about the microbiome. And I think with some of the things that you're going to share, like what is it? Where is it? Why are we outnumbered by this? I think everyone could benefit a little bit more from this curiosity. So first of all, what is the microbiome?
I love it. Okay, so much research and so much science has been pouring into this field in recent years. So the definitions are changing almost daily, right? How we perceive these things and how we used to perceive these systems in the body. With that said, right, a biome really is an ecosystem, right? A microbiome is a smaller ecosystem. You have a microbiome and you have a macrobiome, right? So you, Christy, me, myself, James, you are a microbiome in and of yourself. I am a microbiome in and of myself. You are an ecosystem within you. I am an ecosystem within myself. And we have a relationship to the macrobiome, right? This larger ecosystem that is our environment, and that is the planet in and of itself. Okay, so a microbiome is an ecosystem. But in parts of our bodies, there's various organs, various systems, there's microecosystems, right? So a very popular biome is the gut microbiome, right? It's getting a lot of attention right now, and it is very fascinating. It's very exciting to have all these amazing thinkers across the world be diving into this research, right? So let's take the gut microbiome, for example. What is it? What is its function? Okay, so the gut microbiome, this ecosystem begins in the mouth or the nasal cavity, which are separate biomes, right? Begins there, and it's the entire GI tract, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, colon, to the anus. That entire tract is what we now think of as the gut microbiome, okay? So that's what it is, and that's cool. But now we got to ask, okay, well, what does it do? And this we could talk about for days, weeks, months, and years, I'm sure. So the gut microbiome is essential to life. It's essential to human life. The gut microbiome is an entire population, if you will, of microorganisms. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, viruses. Quickly with viruses, a virus, though, isn't a living organism per se, but that's still included in the microbiome. Because in order to be in the microbiome, you have to be alive. That's perhaps in a sense sentient. Maybe we'll get back to that later. But viruses are included because they are responsible for so many processes within the microbiome and that function. So we have to include them, right? And so, okay, we have this ecosystem of all these microorganisms in our body, the numbers of which are fascinating. I believe we have 10 to the 15 viruses within our body. And that's just viruses. We can go down the line when it comes to the protozoa, the bacteria, the fungi, so on and so forth. We're talking numbers that don't have names within us. and they sustain our life. So, okay, what do? They keep us alive. We have a trade that's happening, okay? It's very simple. We feed them and they help sustain our life. That's the trade, right? It's a very important relationship. Oftentimes, if you're looking at the research, they're referred to as microorganisms, and there's all these scientific terms that describe them. And to me, sometimes that's great. Obviously, it has its place. But if we could shift our perception a little bit, and this may sound silly, maybe not, they're our friends. They can be our friends. And we need to cultivate healthy relationships and healthy friendships in our life, right? For many various reasons, right? So to look at our gut microbiome, this ecological system of friends that are here to help us, I think it makes it more personal. And I think it makes it more intimate. And for me, it makes me feel a bit more warm and fuzzy on the inside that I have these friends that want to help me live. They want to help me live a harmonious and balanced, optimized life. And that's a beautiful thing. So I feel, so that for me inspires a sense of gratitude. And that makes me want to take care of my body more effectively, because I know if I'm taking care of my body, my mind, my soul, my spirit, I'm also taking care of all these little friends that are doing most of the work to begin with. So that,
yes.
I'm sorry, in itself,
yes.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Deal. Okay. So that in itself is fascinating. And that is what that's how I, describe the gut microbiome specifically and how it functions and how I relate to it within my own reality.
Oh, I love that you said ecosystem, because when I think of an ecosystem, I think of so much diversity. We're not just an ecosystem of like 1 or 5 or 17 bacteria like you might find in your probiotic. And we're not like one good and bad parasite. There's this diversity. And so when you're explaining the microbiome, word diversity keeps coming up, and so does the word sterile. Can you please explain how we are not sterile, and how that by sterilizing and killing this bacteria inside and on us, how we may be actually creating more imbalances? And is that good? Should we be attacking this microbiome, or is it better to be contributing to like its diversity? Some people think that bugs are bad, bacteria is bad. How can we shift that conversation right now?
Yes. Okay. So there's a popular term among some fields of biology, and it's this: biodiversity equals biosecurity.
Ooh.
So what the heck does that mean, right? It means that the more diversity we have in an ecosystem, the more secure and stable that ecosystem is. And it's going to function more in homeostasis, within a homeostasis model, right? Homeostatic model. And so this idea of sterilization is a pretty wild concept, because when we look to nature, which is sustaining our lives as Homo sapiens, right? You see such immense diversity and communication, right? This plethora of dynamic life, right? This plethora of ecosystems and trillions upon trillions of these microorganisms that are coming together, most often harmoniously, right, to create this life. So sterilization does the exact opposite. So to sterilize something, to pasteurize something, is to literally destroy the ecosystem within that substance. So it goes against the grain of life to do so. Granted, in the medical field, there's certain situations where perhaps sterilization, again, maybe in acute, very specific circumstances, is necessary and helpful, right? But this general movement towards sterilization, unfortunately, is what got us in this boat to begin with. And when I say this boat, unfortunately, we're experiencing a lot of disharmony in our environment and the health of our environment and the health of our species, whether that's nationally or internationally.
Yes.
And if you look at the statistics regarding popular diseases, perhaps specifically in our country, they're all, for the most part, doing upward trends. And again, that ties back to this movement of sterilization. And And unfortunately, everything that happened last year, again, unfortunately, kind of added to this movement, kind of picked up speed where, okay, let's declare war on germs. Let's declare war on viruses, right? And let's just see how this goes. It's not going well, right? I guess that's obvious. And so perhaps we could dig into germ theory and terrain theory for a quick second.
Yes, I would love to, because this was so pivotal to me when we put together the microbiome, diversity, ecosystems, and what is a germ and what is the terrain, and how did we get so far down into this rabbit hole of germs are good, bad, they're going to kill us, etc.
It's a good question, and I like it too, because this will allow us to dig into the history a little bit, right? Of how we got here. So it never fails to amaze me. Well, I love history, big fan of history and biology, obviously. They go together quite like this. It never fails to amaze me how one person can have such an influence on the world, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. In this case, arguably negative, right? So in the 1800s, there was a couple of scientists, one by the name of Antoine Béchamp. And again, that's my most creative way in saying that name in that accent. Forgive me. And the other gentleman was named Louis Pasteur. So Louis Pasteur really developed and put on the table this idea of germ theory, right? And I want to point out to you guys his last name, Pasteur, pasteurization. That's where that came from, this one particular gentleman. Okay, so his idea was this. The root cause of disease is ultimately germs, to keep it very simple, right? And so we need to sterilize and we need to pasteurize in order to destroy these germs to create a healthy environment. So that was his theory. And it's very much a theory, right? Because now we know how that played out. Okay, Antoine Béchamp, if you will, he came up with terrain theory, where he took Pasteur's idea and said, well, that doesn't really make sense to me. Here's why, right? Disease and illness isn't a product of negative, harmful, pathogenic germs, right? Disease is a product of the terrain, and it's our circumstances and ultimately our relationship with our macro environment and our micro environment.
Yes.
In other words, to boil that down, what Béchamp was saying was, when you create vulnerability in your ecosystem, micro and macro, you're inviting disease to occur. You're sending in an invitation, right? And so Pasteur and Béchamp kind of went back and forth for a while. And as they say, Pasteur, before he died, actually conceded his argument to Béchamp, which tells you everything you need to know right there.
Yep. And
so that was kind of the history and the evolution of, unfortunately, pasteurization and sterilization, because then we here in the West took Pasteur's theory and we ran with it, which again ties us back down to kind of where we are today. And you can see that certainly within our foods, where we've taken this huge shift away from fermentation to pasteurization.
Wow. Right? Yes.
A little bit of how we got here, a few other variables involved. That's the story.
Well, you mentioned a vulnerability, and that's a really key point in this germ versus terrain theory. How come people can be exposed to a bacteria, a virus, influenza, etc., and you got 20 people in the room, and let's say 10 of them have intact terrains. And by intact terrain, let's say a homeostasis, where their immune system and the diversity and their microbiome and their nervous system can adapt to stressors. They're not getting so bottomed out that any little thing is overwhelming. Versus the other 10 people in the room, they've had chronic stress, they've been on tons of antibiotics, they eat GMO foods, processed foods, etc., which all kind of knock down the terrain, lessen the diversity. And so maybe there are vulnerabilities, like you were explaining, the microbiome is everywhere, right? Especially in the digestive tract. So when that digestive tract loses its diversity and its integrity, that's when the terrain really starts to shift. It becomes more vulnerable. And that's when, are you saying, we get a virus or a bacteria or some sort of imbalance, allergen, etc. And because the terrain is weak and imbalanced, then we have symptoms. It's not the germ, it's the vulnerable terrain that we couldn't adapt to.
Correct. I think that's really well said. And two, again, back to the gut microbiome, we're discovering so many things about it right now in real time. And I'll mention this as well. Antoine Béchamp, a lot of his studies involved fermentation. So he was very much getting at this notion of the gut microbiome, right? He was playing with bacteria, right? If we could pull him out of the spirit world and put him right here in this conversation and show him some of the science, I'm sure he would be absolutely amazed, but probably not surprised, because he had, kind of stumbled upon that perhaps first in a big way.
Well, it's so there's this one picture in this little microbiome book I have, and it shows like a human being up to their neck. That's like we're 90% microbiome, and we're 10% cells. Now, if we can, let's shift a little bit to the cell, and the cell has these receptors on it. And some of these receptors contribute to the endocannabinoid system. And then we can pull this all together. So we've got bacteria, we got the micro ecosystem in us. We know that outnumbers the cells, but some of these cells have receptors, and that's what dominates the endocannabinoid system. Let's all get on the same page. Can you give us a brief overview of what the endocannabinoid system is in its function?
Yes, happy to do so. And today is a day where we should absolutely discuss it. So again, I'm going to say this. There's still so much research being done on the ECS, right? This again is it's a new field. This is a new topic, right? We really only stumbled upon this particular system in the late 80s, early 90s. There's so much more to discover. So the definitions are changing, again, daily, weekly, monthly. But in a nutshell, right, the ECS, endocannabinoid system, is a system of receptor sites spread out throughout the entire body. There's concentrations of these receptor sites in specific organs, right? But it's this massive system that we think now primarily is responsible for aiding us in adapting to stress. Stress in the microbiome or the macrobiome, right? And it's performing this effort to maintain, guess what? Homeostasis. Much like the gut microbiome, mind you, right? Every system in the body, arguably, is trying to maintain this balance, right? But the endocannabinoid system is a fascinating system as well as the gut microbiome, as far as I'm concerned, right? Because it seems to be this signaling system. It seems to be this wireless network, right? Okay, so when we're talking about a wireless network, we're talking about a signaling system. In essence, we're talking about communication, right? So the ECS, when optimized and in good health, right, enables the body to communicate through the various systems and microorganisms effectively. I would venture to say it also enables us to communicate with our macrobiome and our environment more effectively as well.
That is beautiful.
That's the ECS in a nutshell.
Yes. So some of the stressors that it might be hearing and signaling about, it can be anywhere from the liver to the gut to the brain to the skin to the kidneys. Like every system is getting governed and brought into balance by a healthy, like you said, functioning endocannabinoid system. What if this system is not healthy and not functioning? What are some of the signs and symptoms of that?
So we're talking about miscommunication, right? And so when we're talking about miscommunication, there's a piece of information that can be sent but isn't received by the receiving party, right? So that information isn't transferred effectively, right? And so we're going to have issues, right? And so experiencing an endocannabinoid system that is imbalanced and a gut microbiome, for example, that is imbalanced, right? we're going to experience a lot of health issues. We're going to experience, first and foremost, a lack of energy, right? Which is going to translate psychologically, emotionally to a more apathetic approach to life, or this lack of desire to want to engage in life, right? Ultimately, too, we can experience a lot of mental issues, whether that's brain fog, you name it. In fact, I'll just zip forward and say dementia, Alzheimer's are your more severe results of a dysfunctional ECS and microbiome. Again, that's on the extreme end. And I just got to say, I was reading an article a few days ago, and 1 out of every 5 females in our nation will experience Alzheimer's in their lifetime, and 1 out of every 10 men. And those statistics are getting worse, unfortunately. So that was a little bit discouraging, but then through the biology, you kind of, and through paying attention to what we're doing with our environment on a national level, that all makes sense. And what I'm talking about is toxicity. Perhaps we can tie down and discuss a little bit about how toxicity, right, comes into play with all of this in a very big way, right?
Yes.
So,
write that down.
Yes, please. So back to, an imbalanced ECS and microbiome, you're going to experience health issues galore. And I've talked about a few. As far as the gut microbiome being imbalanced, you're going to experience a lot of indigestion. You're going to experience a lot of constipation, so on and so forth. And those are very uncomfortable issues to have. Again, I want to say this: whenever we intentionally or unintentionally create an imbalance, we have the opportunity inherently to bring that back into balance, right? To regenerate that issue, to rectify that. Because the human body is an instrument that is incredibly amazing and comprised of all these microorganisms and this amazing signaling system. Christy, what we've been given by creation is absolutely extraordinary, right? And so I want to honor that for a second by saying that. And I'm looking forward to your next question. I love this conversation.
Well, I want to stay on this just for a second, because you got me thinking that there must be a way that the endocannabinoid system, because it's so vast in the gut and so vast in the brain, just like the microbiome is so vast in the gut, right? So is there any evidence that these two, the bacteria and the signaling, the signaling system, and the endogenous cannabinoids, the ones that we make and the ones that we get from plants, are somehow communicating and co-networking?
Yes. So much more research to be done on that question on this topic. But the idea that comes to mind is this very new concept that's called the endocannabinoid. And this concept was primarily forwarded by a French-Canadian gentleman by the name of Marchenzo de Marzo, who was kind of one of the first to the table of the ECS in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And so he's kind of coined this phrase, right? And his reasoning is very interesting, where he would explain, we identified the signaling system back in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And we identified it as a system. But now that we're 30 years into it, we're realizing, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this system than we realized. There's more than just electronic signals happening. There's long chain fatty acids involved. There's all kinds of very active metabolic processes involved. There's various genes and all this enzymatic activity involved, all in relation to the gut microbiome, which is, I guess, a different system per se, but performing in the same but different way. Yeah. And so coining this phrase is like, we have to expand the term to incorporate all of this new science and all of this meta functioning within this system in relation to the gut microbiome. So that is one idea to kind of explain how they're tied together. I would say in another way, they're tied together because they both exist simultaneously at the same time, right? And so a little bit of history, right? So some of the bacteria we have in our gut are 2 billion years old. The ECS, in the endocannabinoid system, of course, is roughly 600 million years old, right? And some fungi is incredibly ancient as well, right? And so with that said, the bacteria we're here, they predate the ECS, right? And so I'm fascinated with this idea. Does the gut microbiome direct the ECS, or does the ECS direct the microbiome? Are they co-directing? The bacteria were here first. However, the signaling, but the bacteria evolved into this ECS system. They evolved and created this system. Well, why would they do so, right? It's this signaling system, this networking system that will allow and enable us to be able to expand our field of energy, right? Our field of information and what we're able to receive and send, right? It's fascinating. And so there, hopefully that answers your question in a very interesting roundabout way.
It does. And I'm fascinated by this because I love that we're just touching on really, truly, what does it mean to be human? And one of the things that fascinated me about the endocannabinoid biome, did I say that right?
Endocannabinoid, yes.
Okay. Is that when they're doing fecal transplants, they know that when they put all that good bacteria into that delivery system, that it actually upregulates the endocannabinoid signaling in some of the endocannabinoids that we make, which it just shows that we're just touching the surface of how interconnected all of our species are, all of our systems. And that I love that what you're emphasizing is that we can't reduce a imbalance to a disease, like it's only the gut, it's only the nervous system, it's only the hormones, because none of them work independently. Can you touch real quickly on how the gut and the brain are connected and the role on the endocannabinoid system on and why it's so important for these two, the gut and the brain, to speak the same language, and sometimes how that has gone kind of like got disconnected and we don't have that connection anymore?
Okay, sure. So that is often referred to as the gut-brain axis. And in my opinion, you can't talk about the gut-brain axis without talking about the vagus nerve, which is a massive nerve that connects, obviously, the gut to the brain, right? We're talking about a highway of communication, right? And again, I keep saying this, but I feel like I have to. There's so much more research being done on this, and we're learning so much right now. So the definitions and everything I'm explaining could very well change in the near future, right? So let's keep an open mind. Let's stay curious, right? Back to the question. So there's been a pretty large emphasis looking at the Western medical history on the heart too, rather, but the brain, right? As if the brain is the biggest center in the body and that deserves the focus and the highlight. And without the brain, we're basically useless. I want to mention that if you look to the history and the culture of the Egyptians, when they did their mummification process, one of the first organs they took out and threw away was the brain. They found no value for the brain. They just got rid of it. Because the brain really is just the processor, right? It's helping us, enable us processing information very quickly, right? But now, with all this research on the gut and the microbiome and the gut microbiome, we're realizing, well, hold on, the brain is a brain, but the gut is a brain as well. So we have the gut-brain connection, the gut-brain axis, where we're figuring out finally that there's just as much activity, electrical activity, hormonal activity, neurotransmitter, hormonal activity in the gut as there is in the brain, right? So with that said, the focus is now, okay, if we're aiming at a balanced body, homeostasis, right? Good health and well-being, then these two centers both have to be in good shape. And if they're not, what we're going to continue to experience is something that's called leaky gut and leaky brain. I could dive into that, but you guys probably get that. That's not good, right? We want these systems to remain intact, especially in the gut microbiome. We want those bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and so on and so forth to remain in the gut. We don't want them leaking through the mucosal lining in the gut and into the body, because that is going to trigger the immune system and it's going to be a mess. Same for the brain, right? We're now discovering that, guess what? There's bacteria in the brain, right? I mean, decades ago, that very notion was absolutely no, that you can't discuss that. That was excused. That cannot be talked about around the table in the medical community. That
a sterile brain. It makes no sense, right?
No sense whatsoever, right? So coming back around, right? The bacteria in the brain too, we want that to remain in the brain. We don't want it leaking out. Okay, hashtag again, perhaps Alzheimer's and dementia for that reason, right? And so to sum all that up, right, with the gut-brain connection and this axis, right, we need these communication centers to be able to communicate effectively. And we can only do so by helping them maintain homeostasis, by, again, guys, choosing to maintain a healthy lifestyle at the end of the day, right? And how are they communicating? Well, they're communicating, of course, through the endocannabinoid system or the endocannabinoid. They're communicating through neurotransmitters, bacteria, all these microorganisms, all of these messengers, right? That is how they're communicating. And again, to experience homeostasis, they have to be in balance.
This is so perfect. Thank you. Because I always want to emphasize, like you are doing, that all these neurodegenerative diseases don't happen overnight. And so many of them can be prevented by the choices we make and the information and the curiosity that we need to be constantly expanding and adapting to. So now we have the microbiome, we have the endocannabinoid system. You've touched on viruses. Can we touch just a little bit more, and then we'll kind of wrap this all up on the virome itself? Are viruses everywhere, or is there only one floating around right now that is really scary?
According to the mainstream media, there's only one, and we should be deathly afraid of it. That tells you everything you need to know about the mainstream media, right? Because there's just a lack of an understanding of basic biology, which is really what we're talking about, right? We're having a conversation about the topic of biology and ecology for that matter as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, so are viruses everywhere all the time? Yes, of course. There's, I think, roughly 10 to the 31 viruses in the air right now. So the air that you're breathing, Christy, the air that I'm breathing, there's 10 to the 31. We don't have a name for that number. That's how big that number is, right?
That's 31 zeros, isn't it?
Could be. I'm actually not 100% sure, but
that's a lot
of zeros, right? In fact, it's funny. I was chatting with him about this the other day as well, and he was like, "So if you wrote that out, how many pieces of paper would that be?" And good question. It would be a lot, right? It's an unfathomable amount. We can just agree to that, right?
And that's in the air.
And that's just in the air, right? And then within our body, 10 to the 15. I believe within water and soil, it's 10 to the 30, right? So it's just this plethora, although that term doesn't do it justice, of viruses all the time. So I think we have to define what a virus is, because there's so much misconception, right? So a virus is just, the way I would describe it, is just a piece of information. It's just a piece of information. It's an envelope that has RNA or DNA in it. That's basically a blueprint of instructions. That's what a virus is. And there are some viruses, of course, which are pathogenic, right? That can lead to disease, perhaps. But then back to what you said earlier, the camp that I'm hanging out in is viruses help us upgrade our immune system, adaptive innate immune system, right? To be able to grow and change and evolve to current set of circumstances within our macro environment, within the macrobiome, right? They're there to help us. In fact, if viruses were there to destroy us, how come they didn't figure that out yet? We would have been long gone. Our species would have been.
We can't breathe if that's true, right? If there's 10 to 30, 31 viruses in the air, in the water, and in us, I think they're not attacking us.
They're not attacking.
I think it goes back to what you were talking about and explaining, that it's the terrain.
Yes.
That's imbalanced. And if the viruses have always been here, then why suddenly is it such a big deal?
Great question. The viruses are ancient. The bacteria are ancient. Fungi is ancient. They are incredibly old, right? And so there are elders in a big way, right? We should be looking to them for counsel. We should be looking to them as a reflection of how we are meant to live our lives in communion with nature, right? This narrative, though, that we should be scared of viruses is really unfortunate. But I'll say this: unfortunate, but to me not surprising, because we've created so much toxicity in our world in these last decades that, well, what do you know? Now we have this super virus, this mega virus, right? That is harming a lot of individuals. And so what should we do, right? We should attack it. Instead of, wait a second, hold on. Maybe we should look at all the toxicity we created. No, don't do that. Let's just create a way to sterilize this one particular virus, right? And then that'll be the solution. And let's go ahead and ignore root cause. I just said ignore root cause. Does that sound familiar when we're talking about perhaps the Western medical system, right? It's not working. That's just the thing. Because if it was working, how come these statistics for major diseases in our country are all going vertical? If it was working, right? A rhetorical question, I'm sure. But I want us to really think about that. Okay, there's something ineffective with the model. Okay. And if honestly, if we're really going to move forward into the future, these next generations of lives within our nation and our world, we have to get back to nature. We have to befriend the bacteria, fungi, and viruses that help sustain our life, right? Unless we do that, I'm afraid that we're going to continue to go in a very imbalanced direction, to say it nicely.
Well, you mentioned fermented foods earlier, and you just mentioned sort of the topic of toxins, right? Now, we have fermented foods, which are probiotics and prebiotics, and they feed this massive ecosystem, which we don't want to kill. We want to create imbalance. We want to create that diversity and that balance. Now, one of the biggest antibiotics that we are all breathing, eating, drinking, etc., is glyphosate. Huge antibiotic. So I guess I wanted to touch on that because how do you, especially where you live in Manderville, it's really concentrated in your area.
I'm living in perhaps one of the most toxic areas in the nation. I'm living in a very dangerous ecosystem, if you will.
What advice do you have? So we know that there's lots of viruses in the air, and we know that from this conversation that we have to have diversity in our ecosystem. And this one ubiquitous chemical, herbicide, antibiotic, water soluble, etc., is killing not only the diversity on the macro, the earth, but also the micro inside of us. How, any suggestions, solutions you have for anyone listening? How do we clear and protect ourselves from this ubiquitous water soluble antibiotic that's almost unavoidable?
Yes. I guess I'll say I'm very qualified to answer that question. I'm born and raised here in Mandeville, Louisiana. I've spent the majority of my life here, right? I'm a product of this microbiome, right? Of this environment. And so when I said that I'm living in a very, currently a very dangerous environment, that's 100% true. So Louisiana is at the crux of what they call Cancer Alley. We have incredibly high cancer statistics. We had a very hard time with COVID, right? Because our stress load and toxic load was so high because of the toxicity, right? It has a lot to do with the Mississippi River and how absolutely toxic the Mississippi River has become, which is such a shame. And that comes right down to Louisiana, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and obviously out into the Gulf there. And so I've grown up within this environment, within this highly antibiotic environment where 75% of the rainfall that you could test in this environment, you will find toxins like glyphosate, right? And so in order to combat such toxicity, you gotta, because the game is so intense, you got to step up your game, so to speak. You got to raise the stakes. And so, or going above and beyond the call of duty and all those metaphors, right? And so focusing on the fundamentals that keep the body healthy, right? Healthy lifestyle, healthy mindset, proper sleep, and proper exercise, right? And I'll add on a healthy community, okay?
Oh,
Those are critical. They're critical for anyone if you're living in California, New Mexico, New York, but perhaps where I'm at in Louisiana, it's actually more critical due to the level and stress of the toxic environment, right? And so that's just it, right? And so one of the things as far as diet and food lifestyle is eating fermented foods, right? I love fermented foods. My favorite is natto. I'm also a big fan of kimchi. I drink quite a bit of kombucha as well. And I love the flavors of these delicious foods, right? But of course, I love the function as well, right? These foods for me put the fun in function. And so what do? Well, they, very simply put, enrich and strengthen our gut microbiome, right?
Wow.
In another way to say it, remember, they're our friends, right? If we make our friends happy, we are going to feel happy, right? So a happy gut is a happy mind, right? If you have an unhappy gut, you're going to have an unhappy mind. Okay, they're tied together, right? Intimately. Okay, and so fermentation, brilliant. So fermented foods, I love the whole process. I love that it's strengthening my gut. When you eat a nice rich meal of fermented foods, you feel good immediately. You don't feel weighed down. You don't feel kind of brain fog. You feel fresh. You can feel very vibrant, right? Hello, and that's the point. That's what we're supposed to be. We're meant to feel optimized in this human body, in this life, and in this relationship with this earth. That's our natural state, is to be healthy, not unhealthy, but healthy, right? With fermented foods as well, I got to mention fiber. Most Americans don't get enough fiber. Turns out magnesium and vitamin D as well. But for fiber, we don't get enough. And why is fiber critical? Fiber feeds as well the gut microbiome. It feeds the bacteria. They love fiber. And so to give them more fiber-rich foods would absolutely be ideal. And for me in my life, living down here in the deep fried South, it's critical that I do so. And so, and I would encourage anyone as well, if you want to take one small, simple step in feeling better, more fermented foods and more fiber. It really can be as simple as that.
Gosh, I love that. Does CBD play a role in any of your suggestions and protocols?
Yes, absolutely. For all the reasons I've described for myself personally, but then to extrapolate that out, it's not just Louisiana that is incredibly toxic. Our food supply, our water supply, all of it is more toxic than perhaps it's ever been in human history. And here we already experience it, right? And so what is that creating? That's creating a heavier stress load
Yes.
in the person. Okay, well, we know that stress ultimately is going to invite disease, right? So how can we help manage the stress? Using phytocannabinoid-rich foods or supplements, right? In order to strengthen our ECS, in order to strengthen the signaling system to be able to cope, manage the stress more effectively, and kind of help bring the body back into homeostasis. Because if we have an issue in the body, we really want to try to resolve it as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And so a cannabidiol product is a perfect way to do that, in my opinion.
All right. I just noticed the time and I'm like, dang, I have so many more things to ask you. Do you want to finish on a rapid fire?
Yeah.
And so we were talking about imbalances versus balance. Let's shift to injury versus repair. And in the principle, like you were just saying with the fermented foods and the rich phytocannabinoids, those are repairing us. Other things are injuring us, like the stress and the toxins. And if our injuries are outnumbering or outweighing the repair, that's the beginning of chronic disease. Or, the strengthening and the embellishing of chronic disease. But if our repair starts to outnumber and become more resilient than the injury, then we have health, healing, adaptation, etc. So I'll say a few words. You say injure, repair, add a sentence on if you want. Glyphosate.
Glyphosate, toxic to the gut, toxic to the brain.
Dehydration.
Dehydration, a big issue in our country. Pure water that's mineral dense is critical to health and well-being.
Collaboration.
Collaboration. This collaboration right now is absolutely wonderful, and I'm so grateful to be doing this with you, Christy.
Thank you. This collaboration is building my spirit, which is less stressful, and it is contributing to my overall well-being. Community.
Community is critical to our species and to every other species on the planet. right? In order for us to maintain our ecosystems in a balanced way, we have to focus on healthy communities.
Versus isolation. What does isolation do?
Last year taught us very well, or rather reminded us what isolation does. Isolation creates disease.
We are not designed for isolation or over sanitizing. It is
Right.
not the essence of life and living and thriving and adaptation. Insomnia, lack of sleep.
So many issues.
Oh my gosh. All right. Okay, a few closing thoughts. I'll ask for your closing thoughts. And can you please, for our listeners, if they would like to get a hold of you, learn more about you, your store, your solutions, how your lectures, etc., how do people get a hold of you?
Yes, thank you, Chrissy. So the name of our store is Sacred Earth Wellness Boutique in Mandeville, Louisiana, indeed, right in the heart of Cancer Alley, oddly enough. The website is sacredearthcompany.com. I post a lot of content on Instagram at Sacred Earth Co. I do a lot of videos, educational videos, fun videos. So for more content, go there, right? And if you want to join our mailing list, you can do so as well via the website. And that's where you'll get information regarding future seminars in store.
That is awesome. So everyone listening, become part of the Sacred Earth community. He is putting out content all the time. We all need and can benefit from elevating our consciousness about health, diversity, avoid isolation. Just know, go back to this, share this, because the germ versus terrain theory, which he was explaining is so powerful. And if you need a really good book that goes into deep detail, The Contagion Myth is a really good. But remember, your body is made to adapt, but it can't adapt if we are just constantly killing the biodiversity that is at the crux of health, healing, prevention, and governing what's good and what's bad. We can all be resilient if we haven't collapsed our ecosystem. So it is Cannabis Day. It is almost Earth Day. Today, please check out our website. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook. Follow James at Sacred Earth. Go out and kiss the ground. Last thought, I just wanted to spit this out there. When you were talking about the fermentation, this is like the difference between fermentation and all that microorganisms versus something sterile, dead, like processed food, is the difference between growing something in dirt and rich soil. We've turned our bodies into dirt.
We have, and it's interesting too, because when I think about soil, I think about gardening, I think about composting, I think about fermentation. Our body does the same thing in a very big way when we're digesting food, right? We are literally reflections of nature in that regard, right? And a rich soil, right, is going to create a rich gut microbiome, right? So an organic garden in the backyard, you're growing your herbs, you're growing your vegetables, you're growing your fruits, and you're consuming those. One of the best things you can do for your body and your family and the community around you, and the microbiome, for example, as well, right? I'm very passionate about soil. We didn't get a chance to really dig into that, pun intended, so much, but maybe we can at a later time, because I love talking about soil.
All right. Then we were going to have a part 2 in the near future with James, and we're going to dig in on soil, because everything grows better in soil. Nothing grows great in dirt. And if you think of yourself like dirt, then let's start changing the scenario. Try to lessen those antibiotics unless they're absolutely necessary. Get your fermented foods, get your endocannabinoid system really fully functioning. Don't fear the virome. It is a genetic update. It is here for our evolution and our adaptation. It's your terrain. And let that just create curiosity, that matrix and that intention that James sent today about curiosity. We can all benefit in our health from being more curious, and replace that fear with curiosity. James, I certainly hope you meant it when you said you'd come back.
I absolutely will, and I'm looking forward to it already. Thank you so much, Christy, for having us. I thoroughly enjoyed this opportunity. And again, guys, remember the intention, let's stay curious. Let's just do that. If anything, let's share the curiosity with our loved ones and let's see what happens.
Sounds wonderful. Everyone be curious today. Big love, peace, enjoy the earth, planet, and your